History of Music, Chapter 1, Music of the Ancients. In attempting to trace the history of music, the progress of the investigator has been impeded by difficulties quite as formidable as those which have attended the efforts of modern explorers to discover the source of the Nile, that historic river upon whose banks Hermes is said to have found his tortoise shell lyre, and whose fertile valleys, rich with the monuments of a glorious antiquity, have contributed so much to modern historical research and enriched literature and art with so many beautiful myths and weird legends. Unlike architecture, sculptures, and painting, music is necessarily ephemeral in its material form, and we therefore possess no specimens to acquaint us with its character during remote periods. Yet all of these bear witness to the fact that it has been cultivated in some form from time immemorial, even among the most uncivilized race of men. We trace its existence through the beauty, philosophies, and mythologies of the Greeks, have its mysterious power symbolized in the Homeric legend of the sirens, whose sweet songs lured the ill-fated mariners to destruction, find its images engraven upon the ancient tombs and nobelisks of Egypt, everywhere gilding the twilight of antiquity with its suggestive presence. To present to the reader, therefore, a comprehensive view of the music of the early Greeks and Romans, and of the ancient Asiatic and Oriental nations, or give the briefest outline of all the extravagant speculation that has been indulged in concerning them, would carry us far beyond the limits allowed in the present chapter. We would therefore confine our observations to those important facts, the authenticity of which is attested by the existence of material proof. The earliest tonal systems of which we have any authentic record, the only one which has exercised any influence upon modern music art, is that of the Greeks. It was invented by the Pythagoreans, the noted Greek philosopher. It was invented by Pythagoras, the noted Greek philosopher and mathematician, about 550 years before the birth of Christ. He is the author of what has been characterized the immutable system. The musical scale consists of 7 tones corresponding to the 7 planets, viz., Moon, Mercury, Venus, Sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. It was the result of certain mathematical deductions based upon the assumption that a mysterious relationship exists between the laws governing the movement of the heavenly bodies and the laws of their harmony, that the distance between the Earth's center and their respective orbits in some way determines the intervals in which the tones of the scale should be divided to produce harmonious sounds. It may be proper to mention, incidentally, that he conceived a similar analogy to exist between color and sound, that the 7 colors of the rainbow corresponded to the tones of the scale, and that certain combinations of these colors, when blended together, produce upon the eye the same harmonious and pleasing effects that a similar combination of tones produce upon the ear. Thus, music was a subject of profound speculation among members of the order of Pythagoreans, who studied it in its relation to nature. With them, it represents the music of spheres, brought within the narrow scope of man's finite sense of perception. The lyre was their favorite instrument, and its sweet music soothed discordant passions and attuned their souls to the eternal harmonies of the universe. It's the music of the early Greeks. Page 10. In making a cursory survey of the conditions of music in the early history of human progress during the period in which it first came to a recognized, though ill-defined, dimly comprehended place, we are naturally led to Greece, the cradle of all the arts, and to whose early spirit of investigation and active intellectuality we owe the solid foundation upon which the progressive civilizations of succeeding centuries has reared. In its noble proportions and marvelous symmetry of beauty, the magnificent superstructure of the most refined and elevating art that adorns our modern culture, music was to the early Greeks an art highly esteemed indeed, but rather in the light of something mysterious and inexplicable, instinct rather than positive knowledge, leading its investigators to a faint comprehension of its high mission. Hence, it did not attain the dignity of an independent, self-sustaining entity, but was associated with poetry, drama, and the dance. Neither, as in Egypt, from which it derived its traditions, was its cultivation confined to a class or order, but was generally esteemed and practiced according to existing theory. It was deemed a strong incentive to virtue, had a place in devotional service and at the public games, and above all, was considered an essential accessory to the drama. The classical drama was produced with imposing surroundings, and in its pure intellectuality has not been surpassed by any modern creations. There were a chorus, principal characters, and an instrumental accompaniment. The melody was sung in unison, carefully attention being bestowed upon the rhythm, but nothing in the theoretical works of the Greek writers indicates that they knew anything about the principles of harmony, although the use of the intervals of the octave, the fifth and the fourth, was common. Pythagoras began the system of the ratio which tones bear to each other. He declared the octave, the fifth, and the fourth to be the perfect consonances. This was an important step, and harmony in part writing might have been developed. This was an important step, and harmony in part writing might have been developed had he not decreed that the third was a dissonance from without this most musical of all intervals, there could be no harmony, as modern musicians understand it. Pause. It took me almost like, that is so important. The understanding of that made all the music theory I studied for like over a decade make sense. The understanding that everything is based on thirds. That is something I need to, I'll make videos about. I'm sorry, I'm pausing anyone that's actually wanting to just hear the reading of this, but that is so important. It took me almost like 20 years to realize, like, I don't know why, if the people could just teach. My camera once again died. Pythagoras is also supposed to have extended the scale to a complete octave, accomplishing this by adding a string to the 7-stringed lyre of Terpender. Terpender's scale, of course, embraced an octave, but the fifth tone was omitted. Pythagoras, we learn, recognized 3 modes: the Dorian, the Phrygian, and the Lydian. Euclid enumerated 13, while Albius added 2 more. The instruments in use by the Greeks were the lyre, the flute, the kithara, and the trumpet or horn. While we are led to wonder that so cultured a people as the Grecians should not have progressed to the development of the principles of harmony, it is not difficult to ascertain and comprehend the reason. The severe simplicity was an essential feature of Grecian art and architecture, and nothing was regarded with more vehement disfavor than a tendency to frivolity. When the singers begin naturally to add embellishment to their tones, we find Aristophanes in his comedy The Clouds, thus satirizing this departure. Had any one for sport essayed such shakes and thrills to practice, like Phryne's has now introduced, neck-breaking skip and flourish, of stripes he'd had a measure full for holy art corrupting. Damon of Athens, the musical tutor of Socrates, held that the introduction of a new and presumably enervating scale would endanger the fabric of the state, and that a single key could not be altered without imperiling the future welfare of Greece. Plato maintained that only music that ennobled the mind should be tolerated, and that it was the duty of the lawgivers to suppress that which possessed merely sensual qualities. Thus, as music was in a sense a recognized custodian or safeguard of the public virtue, the very jealous care with which its integrity was guarded closed off the only avenue to its true and perfect development, and left that work to a later and less severe civilization. So that's the end of the Greeks. Egyptian, Chinese, and Hindu music. Let's see if we get some better lighting. The early Egyptians had a musical system, but it was jealousy confined to the priesthood, who cultivated the art in private and employed it to intensify the mystery with which they invested their system of worship. On ancient monuments are found representations of the instruments which they used: harps with as many as 15 strings, the lyre, the flute, and the sistrum. Little further is known of the music of the Egyptians, but we may at least conjecture that it was of a character befitting that solemn and impenetrable people. A solemn and impenetrable people. As may be expected, when we turn to the Chinese, we find that curious and ancient race to have been familiar from time immemorial with a system of octaves, the circle of fifths, and a normal tone. Like all other nations, their music originated with their religion, and had they been less prosaic and more imaginative in character, they might, upon the foundation, have advanced the art to some degree of perfection. The Chinese, who are proud of their ability to distinguish music from noise, had so little imagination that they never conceived of making it the language of nature, passion, and sentiment. Their music instruments are principally those of percussion, drums of every imaginable shape and size, instruments made of metal or stone, cymbals, wood, and clappers. They have a stringed instrument resembling a guitar, but their preference for instruments of percussion is an evidence of low musical organization. In Hindu music, which is used in all of their religious rites, there is a striking similarity to that of the Greek school. The scales... Oh, excuse me, I lost my place. Where was I? How did I do that? Excuse me for that. There it is. The scales of the Hindu being without the fifth, as in Tapner scale. While the Chinese make the art of music an object of pedantic, prosy speculation, the Hindu theorist rushes to the opposite extreme, ignores its physical and mathematical basis, and loses himself in a labyrinth of fanciful and exaggerated conceits. Their musicians claim at one time to have had 1,600 scales, but it is noticeable that the Hindu often speak of a key when the allusion is only to a melody. The favorite instrument of the Veena, a 7-stringed instrument, very sweet in a tone and said to have been brought to a state of perfection over 2,000 years ago. Music of the ancient Israelites. In the ancient Israelites, we find a people whose influence in the progress of civilization, like that of the Greeks, has been vast and far-reaching. Gifted as a people with the distinguishable characteristics of refined sensibility and poetic temperament, they naturally possessed the most exalted ideas in regard to music, which they associated inseparably with religion, and as their religion was incomparably nobler than that of any other nation, their music naturally sought a higher plane. They addressed the Almighty in hymns of praise, regarding music as divine links which connected man with his maker. Jubal in Genesis 4:21 is referred to as the first musician and inventor of stringed and winded instruments. The agab, a flute, and the kinnor, a small triangular-shaped harp, are supposed to be of his invention. Moses is believed to have acquired a knowledge of the system of music as practiced by the Egyptian priesthood, for he gave directions in regards to the construction of the 2 silver trumpets, which served to give the signals to the children of Israel during the 40 years sojourn in the desert. On the Ark of Titus of Rome is a bas relief of these famous trumpets, and it is claimed that the trumpets themselves were paraded through Rome after the destruction of the temples at Jerusalem. The scoffer, a differently formed trumpet, is found in every Jewish synagogue today and represents the sacred temple horn. Miriam's song of triumph after the destruction of Pharaoh and his host in the Red Sea was the first musical outburst of the Israelites and was probably regarded as a divine inspiration. The scriptures are repleted with passages which reveal the impressive significance which the Hebrews attached to tone. Music would have seemed to have brought the gift of inspiration to the ancient prophet, for we read that when Elisha was before King Jehoshaphat, he commanded, "Now bring me a minstrel." And it came to pass, when the minstrel played, the land of the Lord came upon him. Sacred music reached its highest point in the time of David, who was not only an immortal poet, poet, but an equally inspired musician, and there can be no doubt that during the beneficent reign of Solomon, this, in common with all the other arts of peace, reached a mature stage of development. The Psalms were sung in various ways, antiphonally, sorry, I probably butchered that, by the priests and congregations, by divided choirs, and by the precentor and chorus. Little is definitely known of the tonal system of the Israelites, not even the structure of the scale, but some writers conjectured that they had a system of harmony or part writing, and in support of this claim urged that a people capable of such depths of feeling as were the Hebrews could not rest satisfied with the mere outline of music of which melody consists, but that they must have sought and discovered that rich method of tone coloring which harmony supplies. But it is to be borne in mind that there is nothing in the extensive writing traditions of the Jewish to establish this, and that the Greeks, with their incomparably superior intellectual powers and their searching system of philosophy, failed to develop harmony. The music of Islam. That a people of the peculiar characteristics of the Arab races, in which was blended a noble chivalry, refined hospitality, and a vivid and poetic imagination, should have resolved their preference for rhyme, which is a prominent feature of Arabian poetry, into a form of tonal art, and that their music should be marked by the infusion of a romantic and mystic tendency, is a simple and inevitable conclusion, necessarily evolved from definite conditions. In their poetry, even of the dramatic order, there is a pervading lyrical element indicating the innate musical tendencies and ever suggestive of melody. They had their system of scales in which the tones were divided into three parts, making the octave consist of 17 over 3. I'm not quite sure what that means. Of which 15 over 3 represents the 5 whole tones, and the remaining 2/3 the half tones. The Arabic theory regarded the octave as the principal consonances, and through a preponderance of authority argues that they had no knowledge of harmony. Some maintain that they added a bass part to their melodies. With the Persian conquest and subsequent intermingling of the people came a period of development of the music of Islam, and in 1780 we find the Book of Sounds by Chalil, El-Kindi's theory of composition, arrangements of tones, loss of rhythm, etc. And in the 11th century, the doctor and philosopher Avicenna grasped to some extent the mission of music in his theory that the body was entrusted to man for his development of the soul, that only by ennobling the intellect and purifying the animal passions was reason to be fitted to contemplate the infinite and eternal, and that the ethereal power of music was adapted to the alleviation of physical ailments and to the exaltation of the understanding. As in the case of the Greeks, however, the grasping of intellect and ideal and human meaning and application of music was arbitrarily cut off by the dogmatism of doctrine, and thus, on the threshold of the true knowledge of theory and practice, the octave was abandoned and the system retrograded to the tetrachord and pentachord and a series of useless keys, thus effectually shutting the doors upon harmony. Music of the ancient Romans. In spite of the greatness of the Romans, thus characteristics of indomitable courage and perseverance, which made them the conquerors of the world, of respect from law and aptitude for government, which made their politely the model for all subsequent civilized commonwealths, their genius for organization and combination, which led to so many triumphs in the constructive arts. The historians of music is only able to record that in Rome, the most refined of all their arts had a less lofty flight of ambition when at its highest period, that among the Greeks from whom Rome inherited, and that under Roman custody it fell unlimitedly to a depth of degradation which fortunately has never, either in antecedent or subsequent history, tarnished its beauty or its fame. The Etruscans, the accomplished nation of whom exact traditions gives us so meager information, whose attainments and culture the monuments of antiquity attest, formed the connecting link between Grecians and Roman civilizations, and through their medium was transmitted the surviving traditions of the decayed Grecian school and the similarity in the instruments used to produce musical sounds, the flute, the zither, and the lyre. The most distinctly Roman instruments were those used for martial purposes, chiefs among which was the bucina, by which the movement of the troops was directed. While Rome derived from Greece the basis of its musical theory, it was not a soil calculated to promote the highest development of the art. It lacked a dignified drama and the stimulating influence of poesy, the best of their lyrical poetry, even the odes of Horace, substituting rhetorical redundancy and contemplative philosophy for the passionate heart expression of the Greek muses, and for this reason was incapable of, or at least did not invite, musical treatment. And yet the Romans gained an intellectual insight into the true principles of music for about 50 AD. Diodorus introduced the major third into their diatonic scales as a consonance, which the Greeks had discarded as a dissonance, and thus established a prototype of diatonic scale. Vitruvius in 16 through 13 BC had an indistinct realization of the analogy between music and architecture as having a joint relation to the poetry or form and expression. Macrobius in the 5th century AD elaborated that music themes of Pythagoras and Boethius, who was executed in 524 AD, left behind a work, De Musica, which contained and treated of the old Greek scales of Ptolemy, and which subsequently supplied the foundation for the music of the early Christian church. The Roman tonal art at one period received a beneficial impulse from the Dionysiac rites introduced to Rome by the Greek colonists from southern Italy, but the tendency to sensualism soon usurped the place of pure love of beauty. The dance degenerated into voluptuous posturing. The dominating influence of the virtuosi demoralized the standard of true propriety, and the divine art reached such a degradation of decay that it ultimately fell altogether into the hands of licentious women who used it to attract attention to their meretricious charms, and it was expunged by order of the state from the curriculum of Roman education on the ground that an art practiced by slaves and that depraved and despised was unworthy the training of the patricians' youths. Thus, as the lamp of knowledge was extinguished, the art of music sunk deeper into the gloom than any other in the decay of Rome. Let me reread that. Thus, as the lamp of knowledge was extinguished, the art of music sunk deeper into the gloom than any other. In the decay of Rome, the mythological and classical ages became effete into the dark horizon which bounded the outlook of humanity and progress. There was only to be recognized the hopeful light of the star that had risen in Bethlehem. That is the end of chapter 1. Tomorrow we'll start chapter 2. The early Christian hymnology. I'm sorry for the camera dying. It died twice. These batteries tend to get really hot, or I didn't have them charged all the way, so that was the other thing. But tomorrow it'll be a little bit better. I got the lighting figured out for the desk area, so I won't have the issues as the last video. I just gotta figure out how to sit. Sometimes I was sitting in spots that was hurting my back. But there's chapter 1. There was some cool information in here, and I'm looking forward to reading the rest of this. And that was just 1, 2, 3, 4 pages in a paragraph. This is going to be quite the adventure here. All right, well, see you in the next episode.